Onorato, if you want to.
Hi.
And so I was explained that according to the format, we have the two presentations back to back and then dedicate the final part of the meeting to the discussion. So I will now give the floor to Vasiliki TZIORA, who will present a paper titled Strategies for Eliciting Emotional Responses in the Aegritudo Perdicae. And she is a PhD candidate at the University of Ioannina, and I ask her to please take a few minutes to introduce herself and her research project, and as well as her presentation. So thank you, and thank you. Let's go.
Can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, can I start? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Marco Onorato and Dr. Ignazio Lax for giving me the opportunity to participate in this seminar series. I also would like to warmly thank Associate Professor Vasilios Papas for his invaluable assistance and advice throughout the elaboration of this work, and Professor Eleni Gasti for her encouragement and for the topic of this presentation, which originated from her suggestion. The Aegritudo Perdicae is a Latin epyllion or miniature epic of unknown authorship composed in 290 dactylic hexameters. The poem is preserved in a single 15th century manuscript and is likely dated to the late 5th or early 6th century CE. It thus belongs to the literary production of late antiquity, and more specifically to the Latin poetry cultivated during the period of the Regnum Vandalum in North Africa. The subject of the poem is Perdicae's incestuous desire for his mother, Castalia, the depression into which this feeling leads him, and ultimately his suicide. The poet begins with an invocation to Cupid and offers a cautionary note advising mothers not to read the poem. Following this poem, the narrative shifts to Perdicae's past. Although he had honored all the celestial gods with due reverence and worship, he neglected Venus and her son, thereby incurring divine wrath. As a consequence, upon his return to his homeland, after many years of study in Athens, Cupid leads him into a grove to punish him. There, Perdicae falls asleep, and Cupid, having taken the form of his mother, appears to him in a dream and pierces his chest with an arrow. Upon arriving at his home, Perdicae beholds the woman from his dream and realizes that he has fallen madly in love with his own mother. From this point onward, his physical and emotional decline begins. Resolute in his decision never to confess his forbidden desire, he rejects food and water, progressively wasting away and approaching death with each passing day. Castalia summons various physicians to the house, including the famous doctor Hippocrates, but they are unable to cure her son. Ultimately, having been defeated by his passion, Perdicae decides to take his own life. The aim of the present study is to analyze the full range of stylistic strategies and expressive features systematically employed by the narrator of the Aegritudo Perdicae to guide the reader's emotional responses. Specifically, I will examine how the narrator's subjective tone, his personal involvement in the events, and his deployment of various stylistic techniques serve to heighten the emotional intensity of the scenes and shape the reader's affective engagement, thereby generating a powerful pathos that resonates throughout the narrative. To begin with, it should be noted that the narrator's constant presence and intervention is a defining feature of the Latin epyllion. Each scene of the poem is introduced through narrative intrusions, lamentations, and exclamations, as evidenced in lines 72 to 74, 92 to 93, and 111. Another characteristic feature of the Latin epyllion of late antiquity is the poet's emotionally charged narrative voice, through which he expresses sympathy for his protagonist from the very outset. Apostrophes to Perdicae and emphatic repetition of his name occur at pivotal moments in the plot. During his departure from Athens, line 19, upon his arrival at Cupid's Grove, line 72, and during both the first and second harrowing nights he spends in his family home, lines 104 and 191. The poet underscores the hero's helplessness and expresses his compassion by characterizing him as infelix, miser, and miserandus. Thus, the narrator seeks to shape the reader's reception of the central character through his emotional involvement in the narrative and the consistent use of expressions of sympathy which can be traced throughout the entire poem. The characterizations miser and infelix are, of course, typical adjectives attributed to the elegiac amator, endowing Perdicae with traits of the elegiac poet-lover. These specific adjectives evoke the mournful tone of elegy and function as generic markers. Moreover, Perdicae is described as juvenis, indicating that he is at the typical age of the elegiac lover, an aspect of his character that is emphasized repeatedly throughout the poem. Already in the proem, the narrator reveals to the reader that the subject matter of the poem is the dirus amor of Perdicae, line 6. The adjective dirus signals the deviant nature of this amor, recalling the furtivus amor of Roman elegiac poetry, while the noun amor itself serves as a symbolic metonymy for the elegiac genre. Thus, in addition to eliciting sympathy and compassion for Perdicae, the narrator also anticipates the poem's generic identity, instilling in the reader a sense of expectation regarding its content and outcome. Furthermore, considering that Roman love elegy is quintessentially a genre of failure, the poet predicts the tragic ending of his narrative. Perdicae's unfortunate condition arises as a result of Venus' wrath. He is portrayed as a pious young man who honors all the gods, lines 14 to 15. However, it is emphatically stated through a deliberate repetition that he has neglected the worship of Venus and her son, line 16, thereby incurring divine furor. This tragic reversal from happiness to misfortune, pathos a fortuna, and the emphatic repetition of the adverb hinc, which marks the precise moment at which the incestuous passion is divinely ordained, lines 17, 18, and 21, aim to arouse the reader's pity for Perdicae's fate, thus serving the emotional response the narrator seeks to provoke. Perdicae's arrival at Castalia's house evokes the behavior of the exclusus amator in Roman elegiac poetry. Perdicae is addressed with the stock epithet of the elegiac poet-lover, miser, consumed by the intense passion of a furtivus amor, ardet in incestum, and reaches the threshold, limina, of his beloved, that is, his mother, an element that functions as a generic marker of the paraklapsithyron motive. Upon seeing him, Castalia greets Perdicae with maternal kisses, gestures that cause him pain, line 91, as he now fully realizes the meaning of his dream. The term dolor here clearly echoes the emotional suffering typical of elegiac poetry and thus reinforces the connection to the elegiac tradition. Moreover, the very name of the mother, Castalia, reflects her defining quality, her chastity, casta, which stands in stark contrast to her son's incestuous desire. It is worth noting that at this moment and throughout the entire poem, the readers remain the sole witnesses to Perdicae's feelings. The night that follows is particularly anxious for Perdicae, lines 104 to 114, as he burns with desire, remains sleepless, and sighs, exhibiting the typical symptoms, erotica pathemata, of a love-sick young man. His behavior, vigilant, recalls the pervigilium, a conventional duty of the elegiac exclusus amator. The following day finds Perdicae physically weakened, line 134, refusing both food and water, line 136. An emotion can serve as the driving force behind both physical and psychological changes that influence an individual's thoughts and behavior. The detailed description of Perdicae's emotions allows the reader to focus on the protagonist's dominant emotional state, which is not a fleeting condition, but rather the very engine of the narrative action. His experience of love, in other words, afflicts him with insomnia, loss of appetite, and physical weakness, symptoms that reveal to the reader that he is suffering from melancholy brought on by his pathological passion. The protagonist's romantic emotion is also conveyed in a metaphorical way within the text, following a convention frequently employed by Roman love poets. The poet of the Aegritudo Perdicae draws upon the motif of Militi Amoris 5 times. From the poem itself, the poet evokes the imagery of arrows, flames, and darts, lines 1 and 7, traditional weapons of war which in the hands of Cupid are transformed into instruments of desire, capable of inciting passion in both gods and mortals. In lines 23 to 24, the god of love is described preparing for a battle of love, armed with flames and darts, using a distinctly epic and military vocabulary. In line 117, Perdicae characterizes his emotional suffering as cladis, a term rooted in military language. In lines 194 to 195, Cupid turns his erotic weapons once more against Perdicae. Finally, in lines 261 to 266, epic and military vocabulary becomes especially prominent, through which the poet describes the victory and dominance of the erotic passion over Perdicae. Another motive systematically employed by the poet of the Aegritudo Perdicae is the depiction of love as madness. Throughout the poem, Perdicae's pathological condition is characterized as a form of insanity through the repeated use of the term furor and the adjective demens. These two metaphorical renderings of the emotion of love, Militi Amoris and Amor as madness, reflect Perdicae's intense passion, which has led to the loss of his self-control and ultimately to madness. They are thus deliberately employed by the narrator to elicit the reader's sympathy for Perdicae, who struggles against love while having lost control over his actions. Another strategy employed by the narrator of the Aegritudo Perdicae to emotionally intensify the text is what may be termed emotional intertextuality. That is, the phenomenon whereby the text acquires heightened emotional resonance by drawing upon the pathos of a prior literary model. In such instances, the affective charge of the source text is transferred to the new context, enriching the emotional texture of the narrative. Perdicae himself explicitly compares his incestuous desire to that of Oedipus, lines 125 to 128. The reference to Oedipus by name functions as a clear intertextual marker, while his passion is described as an error, culpam and nefandam, mirroring that of Perdicae, an association grounded in the incestuous nature of both relationships. Later in the poem, Castalia voices her fear that an intense and dangerous passion might lead her son to illicit marital beds, lines 182 to 183. The phrase "enlikitos toros" serves as an intratextual marker of the impious bed, inkestos toros, shared by Oedipus and his mother. Through these references, the narrator seeks to underscore the incestuous nature of Perdicae's love, infusing it with additional emotional intensity drawn from the tragic pathos of Oedipus' story. Another narrative strategy employed by the narrator of the Aegritudo Perdicae is the use of expressionistic descriptions. The poem includes two passages in which the disfigured body of Perdicae is depicted with grotesque detail. The first occurs during the medical examination conducted by Hippocrates. After checking whether the patient has a fever, palpitations, or difficulty breathing, the physician proceeds in lines 161 to 164 with a thorough inspection of the intestinal membranes, the fluid in the lungs, and the youth's ribs. The second passage appears in lines 250 to 256, where the physical deterioration of Perdicae as a result of his incestuous passion is described in detail. Pallor has spread across his limbs, his temples and nose have receded, his eyes betray his sleeplessness, his entrails reflect his prolonged fasting, the nerves in his arms are exposed, and his ribs are wasted away. Furthermore, the poem employs the theme of untimely death, pathos apetate. Perdicae, who as already mentioned is emphatically characterized throughout the poem as a young man, ultimately chooses to die. In fact, through a rhetorical enumeration of possible methods of suicide, Perdicae masochistically provokes Cupid with various options. These strategies, which portray in disturbing detail both a young man's physical degradation and his tragic end, are intended to elicit a strong emotional response from the readers, cultivating their pity and compassion for the protagonist. Finally, it is worth noting that poets who write love poetry often incorporate the emotional experiences of their contemporaries into their work. In the late antique poetry, a very common feature is the so-called poetics of silence, a term of Bernard's Lobato. This period is marked by strong conservatism, rendering the human expression potentially dangerous. During the time of the Regnum Vandalum, Christian faith dominates, and erotic emotion acquires specific moral connotations as it is increasingly perceived as both a fault and a sin. This perception of the era becomes evident in Perdicae's speech during the first night he spends at his home, as he states that the confession of his romantic passion would be sacrilege and its admission a crime, thoughts which, according to the narrator, he repeats constantly, lines 99 to 100. Perdicae equates his romantic feelings with an impious and criminal act, scelus and crimen, evidently due to its incestuous nature, but also in light of the moral conservatism of the time. However, these lines also contain terms related to speech, fari and locutus, which allude to the poetics of silence. The verbal utterance of Perdicae's desire is equated with sin, nam fari scelus est, and in this, the poet possibly hints at his own difficulty in composing love poetry under the constraints of a socially conservative society. Later, when Castalia engages in dialogue with her son and urges him to reveal the identity of the person he is in love with, Perdicae remains silent and only sighs, line 185. His deep sighs, suspiria longa, are a clear symptom of erotic longing. However, he does not externalize his emotions, but instead remains silent. The phrase ille siled could self-reflexively refer to the poet himself. Just as his protagonist is unable to articulate his erotic feelings, so too is the poet unable to truly compose an authentic love poem and thus remains silent. Perdicae even averts his eyes from his mother, unable to look at her out of modesty, and asks her to leave, as her presence only intensifies the torment of the lover, lines 186 to 187. This moment echoes a Christian moral sensibility, since according to the Gospel, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. These lines, however, when read alongside the immediately preceding one, may once again allude to the poetics of silence. The poet subtly signals the transformations occurring in the content of love poetry under the influence of Christianity and the prevailing conservatism of the time. The protagonist of a love poem can no longer be portrayed as committing incest, nor even allowed to gaze upon the object of his desire. Perdicae's illness arises precisely from his inner conflict between amor and pudor. These two emotions are personified during the second night he spent at home, lines 198 to 199, and their conflict brings the narrative to a moment of a great tension. At this point, the poet identifies himself with Perdicae, and the lines acquire a metapoetic significance, once again alluding to the poetics of silence. Amor, who represents love poetry, advises Perdicae's last poet to reveal the secrets, line 200, that is, to cease concealing his erotic feeling and the amorous content of his poem. Pudor, however, symbolizing the conservatism of Christian society, forbids him from expressing himself, line 201. Thus, Perdicae finds himself caught in a dilemma, whether to externalize his love as Amor urges him to do, or to suppress it as Pudor commands. From a metapoetic perspective, these lines suggest that the conservatism of the era, Pudor, prohibits the poet from expressing himself freely and from composing openly love poetry, Amor. In conclusion, the analysis above demonstrates that the narrator of Aegritudo Perdicae systematically employs expressive techniques and stylistic strategies to elicit emotional responses from the readers. The depiction of the furtivus amor that consumes Perdicae, the metaphorical representations of his romantic passion, the adjectives consistently used to characterize him, and the expressions of sympathy towards him all shape the reader's perception, guiding their emotional reaction to the poem's central figure. Throughout the Aegritudo Perdicae, the poet builds the reader's expectation that he will compose love poetry. However, Perdicae's romantic feelings are never verbalized and ultimately remain hidden. In this sense, although Perdicae shares many traits of the elegiac amator and his behavioral patterns, he never utters a single romantic word, and he is condemned to silence, a condition that clearly alludes to the so-called poetics of silence. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Vasiliki, for your very stimulating and insightful presentation. I'm sure it will provide us with plenty to discuss later. And thanks also for being particularly mindful of the time. My timer is ringing just now, so perfectly on point. And so now, according to our schedule, I would like to give the floor to Anastasiia MOROZOVA. I will ask her to briefly introduce herself and her research before proceeding with her presentation, which is titled An Ostrogothic Ruler in Literary Focus, Love, Intimacy and Romanness in the Relationship with the Officials in the Variae. Anastasiia MOROZOVA is a PhD candidate at the Department of Historical Studies at the Central European University, if I am not wrong. And so I ask her to introduce herself. Thank you again. And so on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ignazio Lax. I just wanted also express gratitude to Professor Marco Onorato and Dr. Ignazio Lax for organizing this project, and actually the very idea of the project, PATHOS, sounds extremely interesting for me. As Dr. Ignazio Lax already mentioned, I am currently a PhD candidate at Central European University, and my project generally concerns the exploration of non-religious texts of Cassiodorus within broader comparative framework of diachronic, but also synchronic with a late Roman world and as well with post-Roman world, including the one mentioned by Vasiliki today, of the Abundant Kingdom as well, while applying also to the analysis of literary texts, or just say texts generally, the lens of history of emotions, but also these literary studies combined. I will be taking an ed scholarship in a few months at University of Tübingen, under the guidance of Professor Robert Kienstein. So I hope that this project will continue on. Today, I will speak about, you can see the title, and as it shows, it is my tentative and roughly sketched attempt to examine how literary or discursive nationality, even in such texts as Cassiodorus' Variae, which is not precisely a literary text, what we could call a literary text, but it's another topic for discussion, how this emotionality is interwoven with the contemporary literary world, tastes, and historical context of the addressed audience of the Italo-Roman elite, while also having a social performative function addressing ideological and social-cultural needs. Emotions, especially those manifested in the honorific ceremonial context in the top-down communication, configured and renegotiated social and affective boundaries, presenting the idealized vision while also anchoring them in textuality, circumscribed by literary and rhetorical framework in which this textuality was born. Thus, by the end of the presentation, I aspire to demonstrate how Cassiodorus employed the late Roman literary landscape, including genres, techniques, topoi, to narrate the emotion of love, particularly between the Ostrogothic rulers and their officials, and how this rhetorical play might have engendered a persona of the ruler whose list of necessary virtues or goods introduced homosocial affection. This is the outline presentation and short excursion into the historical background of all Western imperial provinces. Late Antiquity retained the strongest late Roman bureaucratic system and social structures after symbolic dethronement of the last Roman emperor. Established with the conquest of Italy by an Ostrogothic king, Theodoric, the Italian Ostrogothic kingdom accommodated the existing Roman political systems and laws. Although the Ostrogoths played the role of other and uncivilized barbarian in late Roman imperial discourse, mostly, but not only, their conquest of the Apennine Peninsula marked a Gothic shift in power and social hierarchy. A certain Gothic-Roman dualism emerged, in which the Ostrogoths acted as a ruling dynasty, while the Gothic military elite protected the Romans and their civil society. But most of the courts and bureaucratic offices were held by members of the Italo-Roman elite. At the same time, Gothic courts endorsed Roman cultural and literary production, and by the Roman intellectual culture of the elites as a marker of status and means of social advancement. So Cassiodorus was one of the members of the Italo-Roman elite who served as a high official the courts of several Ostrogothic rulers for about 30 years. Variae, a compilation of 468 letters, civic service as a Roman partisan of the continuity of Romanness despite a chain purely suggests the rhetorical agenda of the Variae was precisely to legitimize the Ostrogothic rulers through the image of their virtuous governance, which for Cassiodorus consisted in the values of the ancient Paideia and the institutional and ethical continuity of Roman civilization. Thus, Cassiodorus primarily addressed to the educated Roman elite, to whom they presented in the framework of Ostrogothic, to whom he presented is in the framework of public discourse a vision of Roman identity. Letters of Palatine or civic appointments addressing the appointee and the Roman Senate, which in my focus onwards, were central to this agenda. Designed to celebrate the functioning of the Roman civic apparatus, those 42 letters from the books and 8 written on behalf of both virtuous and reprehensible rulers, praised virtues and merit of concrete individuals, promoted and exhorted the Senate to lend individual approval. In these letters, we find around 67 terms from the Latin lexical semantic fields of love and affection, and various types of love between subordinates and rulers mentioned. But before addressing the emotional love itself, Cassiodorus needs to be also positioned in late Roman literary and rhetorical traditions. Such scholars as Christina Cacridi came to the conclusion that these eulogistic letters to the Senate shared common features with the ancient letters of recommendation, which in their turn repurposed topoi from the encomiastic rhetoric. The second treatise, attributed to Menander provides the best guide for studying the topoi for the late antique encomia of persons, which Cassiodorus, if not accessed directly, might have encountered during the rhetorical education in its Latin variation. You can see here on the presentation the topoi of represented by Menander of praise. In his letters, Cassiodorus shows the surmised familiarity with a technical list of the common places to the personal encomia. To give an example, the letter to the Senate, text. Let's wait until the slides shows well. Did the slide change for you? Yes, I see. Sorry, apologies for this. To give an example, the letter to the Senate, appointing Felix, a member of Gallic noble family, a consul in Rome, while clearly pursuing the agenda of granting the favor and financial support of the Gallic nobility following the conflict with the Franks, still selectively adheres to generic scheme of encomium, which you can see on the screen, mentioning the origin, the native nation, of course, and the family of the candidate, and then his some details about his nature and education, and then coming to the opinion of him showing the virtues, because the candidate was still young. As Laurent Pernaut points out, this topoi of the rhetorical praise offered an implicit anthropology, which combined two essential traits: a biographical order, that is narrative of life in which the character's excellence unfolded, and the ethical portrait, organized according to hierarchy of goods, ascending from exterior goods such as birth and goods of body to goods of soul, that is virtue. But the late Roman Basilicos Logos, or Imperial Encomium Panegyric, provided a comprehensive moral portrait of the ideal person, human being, that the Roman emperor represented, or that the panegyrics projected on the emperor. To simplify for the purpose of this presentation, Cassiodorus' letters provided a sort of an implicit anthropology of the ideal official, being between bottom-up and top-down images of an ideal official, as every panegyric was. These letters offered a list of virtues and goods that both could have construed and satisfied the profile of the Ostrogothic Palatine or public servant. At the same time, the typology of praise, those letters could also be classified, as I mentioned above, as the letters of recommendation, since by the rhetorical function and techniques applied, they attempted to introduce a candidate to the Senate based on his personal qualities or relationship with the Gothic ruler, even if an openness of such recommendation was not relevant to the context of the Gothic royal appointment. It is through an intersection of this anthropology of an official and the discourse of recommendation letters that the Gothic ruler's love and affection towards their subordinates should be approached and considered from a literary perspective. Ancient recommendation letters routinely linked to love vocabulary and rules of friendship, and amicitia as a means of positive characterization of candidates, promoting them through a triangulation, so the triangle of personal ties of friendship to both the addressee, the person between the addressee, person recommended, and as well the narrator of the letter. However, for a deeper analysis of the original love and Cassiodorus' stylized letters from a social angle as well, I suggest to look beyond the encomiastic framework by applying the methodology of emotive scripts and literary identities and looking at several identified emotive scripts of real love in a greater detail. Just a brief outline of the conceptual methodological framework. In recent decades, the emotional scripts approach has gained in the history of emotions, which owes its genesis to the cognitive behavioral theory, theory of filament. Building on the latter, an Icelandic researcher, Sigrid Karlsdóttir, proposed her own concept of emotive scripts and emotive literary identities. So Karlsdóttir suggests distinguishing real emotions, those that a person experiences and feels, and the discursive and literary representation of emotional behavior, of which the named emotive scripts are an element. According to her, and I quote, emotive scripts dictate the rules of emotional behavior in any particular text with narrative structures, and so on. So rather than considering emotions in terms of textually represented practices or lexicographies of emotional words, Karlsdóttir proposes conceptualizing emotions as a set of emotional identifiers marking a literary scenario that is an emotive script. Those scripts could prescribe, be prescriptive, or describe, be descriptive, rules for emotional behavior in the text. If emotives provide a blueprint for emotional behavior, emotive identities, according to Karlsdóttir, dictates and a quote framework for emotional values and behavioral codes that guide the reader in interpreting emotional scripts or in deciphering emotional subtext, end quote. Identities are partly determined by the genre and general conventions of the text, or by their subversion, as in the case of parodies, so that a reading community at a given historical moment usually has several literary identities. The territorial and literary conventions of the genre or type of discourse to which a text belongs, such as epistolography or Hellenistic novella, provide a certain background against which the reading audience reads the emotive script, determining the interpretation of the latter. At the same time, emotive scripts inherent to one literary identity brought in another one, thus producing a new emotive literary identity altogether with an emotional ideology in use of sensibilities attached to it. To the date, Roman literature with its imitation of late Roman examples has yet to be studied through this lens. In this case, considered Variae is a case complex enough to demonstrate the benefits of such an approach. So now coming to particular scripts, waiting till load as well. So based on the vocabulary and its discursive tradition, I managed to identify 5 different things and affection with these letters, but I will focus on the. Let me also do the magic with slides. Maybe it will work. Okay, I will continue, and I hope that the slide will also catch up. Yes, you can see now. So I firstly on ceremonialized affection, because frequently signified with words affectio or affectus, as in King's case, and mark the disposition of attitudes or practically inferior. First, action, quality of service, and virtues, which are all enumerated in appointment. As a feeling, it wasn't that they not just having action disposition of the there's a certain dispositional value, but actually performing it by great favor or benefits. For example, this was the case for an already mentioned before, young Gallic nobleman whom considers impersonating Theodoric wrote in the letter the following, which you can see on the screen. Though comprehensive analysis for virtues and gods praised in the Ostrogothic Regnum is a desiderandum paper, however, in the royal letters of the Variae, there is also an implication and an attempt that ceremonialized affection should be felt equally. And you can see this on the next slide when it loads. Also, although ceremonialized affection did not accompany all appointments of officials, it was apparently recognized or intended to be recognized as a normative code of the Ostrogothic ruler's behavior, a sort of Foucauldian regulatory ideal, as in the books 6 and 7, with the model formulas of appointments. It is said that the ruler's affection manifests itself in the attention to the official in his service, And this is a quote, the last quote on the slide. While postponing addressing another script for a little, even in this ceremonialized script, there are some visible departures. While this type of affection can be understood within an encomiastic framework, as it wasn't unusual to intertwine expression of emotions and encomium, and as a topoi for recommendation letters, which precisely emphasize the affection of the letter's writer or narrator, there are also two major differences. First, that it was unusual to have affection of the ruler towards the official who performed in such an emphatic and non-formulaic way becomes obvious against the background of the emotionally restrained rhetoric and emotive script of the late Roman chancellery, on which Cassiodorus relied in writing his public discourse. The Simonian constitutions, ostensibly preserved in unedited state, contain similar addresses of the emperor to officials, such as you can see them on the screen. They are all formulaic, as they always accompany the official position, and are used exclusively in the vocative case. And second, whenever we encounter this type of affection in the royal letters, it is always focalized through to the ruler. It is his emotions and feelings that Cassiodorus tries to convey, either using the first person adjectives or pronouns. Whenever it is appropriate for the context, like in the letters to the appointee that are never pure encomium, as much as the letters to the Senate, Cassiodorus makes sure to add an apostrophe, the speech in second person to the praised official, which, as Perno calls it, is a quote stylistic translation of a dimension of forms, end quote, in the encomiastic speech. To explain how and from where this idea of an affectionate ruler might have appeared, we need to address the second script, the script of friendly love. So the script of intimate type of love was conventionally marked with the word amor in its derivatives and emphasized physical and not symbolical closeness to the Ostrogothic court. I'll choose one example which will help address the generic pattern behind script, which feels the Roman Senate about the point of Antimedoros, an Eastern Roman aristocrat originally from the Constantinople Senate, to the post of prefect of the city of Rome that goes as follows. And you can take some time to read, but I will proceed further my interpretation. It is possible to ascribe such representations of emotions to rhetorical, which you see here, the rhetorical topoi of recommendation letters, which would be to some extent valid for Cassiodorus' case. However, I also argue that some of underlying topoi play the role of emotional identifiers in the text, guiding the interpretation of the educated audience, which on the basis of the emotive literary identity is known to it, imbue the text with underlying emotional meaning. Particularly here, Cassiodorus uses elements from the late Roman discourse of epistolography of friendship, the conventions of which the Italo-Roman elites used to pen their own correspondence and maintain a network of homosocial relations. While the letters of recommendation could be imagined as a more functional generic definition referring to a subtype of friendship letters, epistolography of friendship would have provided for Cassiodorus a broader spectrum of topoi and ethical themes. This becomes even more visible through a comparative look at the two most read epistolographic collections of the Italo-Romans in the 6th century, Pliny the Younger and Symmachus. So here, the text of Cassiodorus and these authors juxtaposed show that they share tropes of friendship, such as an exceptional loyalty, unity in life, and shared joy and pleasure. Cassiodorus quotes almost verbatim the last phrase in Symmachus' letter to Ausonius, which itself uses a well-known topos of friendly epistolography. The maintenance of friendly ties through the constant communication. While the friendly letter, the letter or love between friends restores the presence of the correspondent and maintains the friendly relations between them, Cassiodorus extrapolates this idea to the relations between officials and Ostrogothic rulers and produces a new ideal of emotional behavior. Quality and faithful service and confidentiality on the part of the official, and conscientious distribution of favors and guarantees of social advancement on the part of the ruler, as a repeated act of affirmation and expression of love and friendship in this asymmetrical power relationship. Furthermore, Decades' epistolography of friendship as an emotive literary identity mainly derives its values and behavioral code from a broader ethical and philosophical ancient discourse on friendship. The list of close interactions between Artemidorus and Theodoric correlates with the Aristotelian way of thinking and the friends as a joint activity that manifests to affection that confirm and sustain love. There's also significant devices deliberately to the description of Artemidorus' moral values. His virtues would have been obvious to the audience through the fact that Artemidorus had always this rules affection, since the ancient ideal of friendship was also based on the idea of union through virtue. Slide should have changed. Yeah, okay. Except the usage of epistolographic discourse for friendship, Theodorus also masterfully focalizes the ethical portrait of Artemidorus through Theodoric to convey a friendly love between them, giving a glimpse into Theodoric's, as Ricardor calls it, emotive interiority. By also providing some information about the offices and services he had undertaken, Theodorus makes sure to keep Theodoric's personal feelings and emotions at the center of the incoming fragment, amplifying with each new sentence. First comes the episode of comfort that Artemidorus provides to Theodoric, which is followed by by Theodoric's son, as also being the tribute of pleasures. And ultimately, Theodorus finishes the sequence with a shared royal dinners, to which one might assume was entitled only the closest circle. The relationship between the king and Artemidorus is amplified and pathetically involves audience in Theodoric's feelings and maximizes the impression of exceptional personal closeness between them. Sexual friendship is re-emphasized by using color. The word reserved in Theodorus' collection only for the relationship, which at this point has to reaffirm the script of friendly love and decipher its audience. Some of the through the literary technique of focalization in using emotive states of epistolographic friendship, Theodorus created an affectional persona of the Ostrogothic. But the main question is, what is the reason for this shift in rulers' emotional state from rhetoric from actors to rhetoric of affection and friendship? Why love affection has become a part of the image of the ideal post-Roman ruler? So first, it serves a rhetorical function in Theodorus' text, obviously. The Gothic ruler imitates the virtues of imperial generosity and philanthropy. So expressive intimate love for Artemidorus or warm affection to Felix does not necessarily have relation to the king's true feelings, but is primarily intended to represent and sustain his quasi-imperial status. However, I believe that the historical context should be also taken into account. It reveals that the relevant late imperial norms of like expression of love disappears in post-Roman context. The Gothic ruler was less sacred, powerful, and symbolically, physically distant than the deified late Roman Emperor Dominus. In such a context, regional love scripts functioned as a Gothic self-representation strategy, fashioning themselves as Roman successors. Furthermore, expressing love offers proactive behavior, which legitimizes Gothic outsiders. Performance of love, according to the conventions of epistolography of friendship or any other mentioned Latin literary forms, was a form of indicating belonging to by the thus to the social elite and playing into elite ways of being Roman. And lastly, Gothic strategy of condensation, by which I mean collapsing ethnic and social distances between Goths and Italo-Romans, king and his officials, in an affectionate persona of the king through shared Roman habitus of love. Also, all the strategy of condensation recognized and meant to symbolically bridge these distances. In this case, the inversion of power between Goths and Italo-Romans was marked through the projection of the familiar norms of late Roman social friendships onto the relations between the Gothic ruler and his subordinates and profession of their shared Romanness. To some conclusions, Theodorus' writing love and affection of the Ostrogothic ruler was lacks negotiation between different literary and rhetorical genres. Motive literary identity, contemporary power dynamics, and current identity anxieties of the Italo-Roman elite. Well, at the first glance, his letters of appointment just follow the alternatively interwoven technical characteristics for an encomiastic speech and a letter of recommendation. And the fact of the ruler created in the process marks a striking part of an imperial emotive reality, taken as an imagined reference. In the Gothic shift in power, Cassiodorus adapted the imperial formulas of affection to fit the social, cultural, and ideological demands of his patron, the Gothic dynasty, and his audience. Two scripts of regional love, ceremonialized affection and love, both show their own and reach and Ostrogothic affection as the life. But ceremonialized affection normalized as a part of emotional behavior, love of friendship brought in higher discourses as a emotional identifiers, such as epistolography, to engage with the elite audience and their horizon of feelings. Most importantly, a persona of loving king bridges the ethnic and social distance between Goths and Italo-Romans, but it also ultimately reproduced Roman sensibilities of homosocial love and friendship, is expressed in epistolography as normative procedures for both Variae and scribe courts, rulers, and their officials of the elite, which pursue languages via the Carolingian reception. Thus, one can see that even, and especially in official public discourse and bureaucratic communication, such as Variae, which by no means corresponds to the modern idea of directory site in professional bureaucracy, the narration and construction of love was a subtle, literary, and social performance. It combined both the profound knowledge of contemporary world, rhetoric and literature, and universal, in scare quotes, literary techniques, adapting all models to create new meanings, rooted new in the ancient. In them, it reminds us that the sincere to a modern eye performance love and also Gothic public discourse was a form of authenticity and available in Roman in a post-Roman time. Thank you very much, and apologies for taking a bit too long.
Thank you very much to you, and don't worry, it's perfect on time this time also. And it was really a very insightful presentation and very rich, offered a sophisticated analysis, not only on the text, but also on Cassiodorus' word in general. So thank you very much, Anastasia. And we can now open the floor for discussion. And as the chair of this session, I would like to open this moment with a few brief remarks, starting with the first of the two papers we heard. Vasiliki, an observation you made was particularly insightful to me, and the reader remains the sole witness to Perdicae's emotions for the majority of time. And it was particularly striking to me how a significant portion of the adaptation of the elegiac genre's stylistic features is inevitably mediated by the narratological choices, by the choices of the unengaged narrator. Given this, could this kind of a narratological analysis through a focused look at the displayed emotions of the narrator also can help us to better understand the poem's generic characteristics. So, in other words, does the narrator's specific emotional-driven rhetorical strategy define the work's itself relationship with the genre? I don't know if I was clear,
Yes.
but it's a very interesting question to me, so I am very curious.
I believe that the poet of the Aegritudo, Perdicae, shows in many ways throughout the poem that Perdicae is like an exclusus amator, and that he's in love with his mother, and that he suffers from this emotion because he wants to show through the poetics of silence that even though he wants to write an authentic love poem, he actually cannot deal with this theme as he would like. So this poem is not an elegy, but the poet also shows through the Poetics of Silence that his intention was to write a love poem.
Very, very interesting, and that's a narratological aspect that it's very, very important. Yes, and thank you very much. Maybe others will ask something else, but I would like also to ask something to Anastasiia by now, and then I will leave the ground to other. I found a prismatic relationship between literary genre, stylistics, internal emotive scripts, and their simultaneous pragmatic effect on society to be very interesting in the text you analyzed. And also, your analysis of the friendly love script highlights also the intimate detail of an adorned royal table, the royal table. And are there other examples of this kind? So what is the significance of these specific spaces, objects? How do these physical settings function as a rhetorical stage that maybe validates the emotional claims made in the letter, made in the public performance of the emotion?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Because unfortunately, we cannot access like direct sources which would describe the exact communication or phrases or expressions that's generally in these settings. All we have is like these glimpses through the rhetoric and through the applied strategies, rhetorical strategies, if you want, of these settings. But of course, the table is quite an exceptional case. I think this is the only example where Cassiodorus, throughout the Variae, gives like such a vivid image, this kind of vividness as a rhetorical instrument in this case, that there is like a royal table and this person is particularly always invited to this table. And other spaces here, of course, which he of course emphasizes is the courts itself. So it's more abstract, an abstract idea of the court closeness, and this what he emphasizes continuously is this personal conversations which the ruler and the official could have, and this level of confidentiality that they share. There is also one interesting mention of how official went to hunting together with a king, and during these huntings he like retold the legal cases which he heard of, and thus helped to assuage the anger of the ruler by presenting and mediating the presentation of the gravity of these cases by himself. So there are the spaces, elite spaces of the courts, a space of consumption of food, like royal table, and there is a space of leisure, the space of hunting, I would say.
Okay, so it's very interesting also this idea of settings, objects, how they can stay in these relationships and this sentimentalized way of living this kind of things. So are there any other questions? Thank you very much. And are there any other questions? Okay, so okay, please, the first question.
It's Professor Eleni Gasti.
Professor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
Thank
Professor.
You. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the organizers and, of course, the speakers as well. Maybe this question is a follow-up to your question, Ignazio. Given that the poet, and it refers to Vasiliki, it has to do with Vasiliki's presentation. Given that the poet describes the subject using the phrases culpa nefanda and nam faris scelus est, that is the poetics of silence, as you described it, and to my opinion, as a self-referential apology, nefanda culpa and scelus fari, nam scelus est fari. This is for me a self-referential apology. How might the audience, particularly a Christian readership, react? And is the poem primarily driven by emotional engagement? And who cares about the incestuous love of Perdicae and his mother? This is my question. Thank you.
So what was the first question?
About the reaction and the of the audience. The audience. The readership. Are they Christian?
Yes, the poem Aegritudo Perdicae was written during the Regnum Vandalum in North Africa, and the society was Christian and very conservative. So the poets did not write during that period authentic love poems. We don't find that. So this is why the poet cannot actually deal with a love story.
Yes, and this is a nefanda culpa, nefanda, ne fari, nam fari scelus est, the poetics of silence, as you said. And I wonder if the poem is primarily driven by emotional engagement and nothing else. The poet uses every means to affect the audience.
Yes, I think this is the intention of the poet, to actually show how much Perdicae suffers, but at the same time that he cannot actually express himself and say that he's in love with his mother in this case.
Okay. Ignazio?
Yes, and it's very interesting because nefanda, so Perdicae can't talk about his emotions and also his love. So it's nefanda, is a nefanda kind of thing. And I also see Professor Papa's question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor
Ignazio.
Gasti. Welcome.
First of all, I would like to also congratulate the organizers for this excellent series of lectures. It's very important to give the opportunity, the floor to young researchers to present their work. It's really very important. So I have two questions for you, Vasiliki. First of all, thank you very much for the excellent and very well-structured work. I would like to ask you, what do you consider? You consider that the death of love at the end of the poem equals to a protest by the poet against the sexual annunciation of the era, Late Antiquity, or rather to an agreement with it? I say this because in many Latin texts of Late Antiquity, for example, Per Vigilium Veneris, especially at the end of the poem where the poet says, I cannot talk in this era, Enodius in his Epithalamium, for example, Maximianus in his Elegy 5, several poets protest against the sexual renunciation of that area. What do you think about that? Thank you.
I believe that the poet does not agree with the sexual renunciation, and that he shows that because of the Christian society, and that is that is very conservative. The poet cannot actually write an authentic love poem. So at the end of the poem, that Perdicae takes his own life with the Cupid, the poet shows that this is the end of the love poetry. The love poetry dies.
Do you think that it's important that he takes his own life with a feminine way?
Yes, I think that.
Not by, sorry, Vasiliki, not by knife, for example, by knife.
Yes, I think that at this point, the text engages in a literary dialogue with a lot of other texts, with Ovid and many others, and I think that the poet does this because we know that the poetry that was written during that period was particularly elitist. So I think that's the reason Perdicae kills himself in this way.
Great. And if I may, another one question, Ignazio?
Yes, of course.
About the silence in general, for example, Hippocrates talks himself, the poet says, locutus se. Secum. This too is a common element in the poetry of late antiquity, in Latin poetry. I mentioned the final stanza, for example, of Pervigilium Veneris, or Sidonius Apollinaris' Carmina. He says, he mentions somewhere mutus Apollo, mute Apollo. Do you think that this too is related to the renunciation of love? Silence. Do not speak about that, I mean.
Yes, I think that it is related to the poetics of silence, and in Aegritudo Perdicae, Hippocrates examines Perdicae, and he talks in a lot of verses, but he cannot actually say the reason Perdicae is sick. He never says that the reason is love. So love is never mentioned in the poem except from the narrator.
Thank you very much. Many congratulations to Vasiliki and Anastasia as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And Professor Onorato?
Yes, congratulations to both our speakers for their brilliant presentations. I have questions for both of them. I start from Vasiliki TZIORA. Have you studied so far how Ovid might have influenced the portrait of emotions in the Aegritudo? I'm referring in particular to the possible influence of Book 10, the Metamorphosis, where the poet narrates Mira's incestuous love for her father Cinyras, emphasizing the conflict between love and shame and the girl's reluctance to reveal her feelings. There too, the theme of silence is crucial. And then a question for Anastasia. Can we consider the possibility of a broader contextualization of the mixture of paternalism and the revival of the vocabulary of friendship in some of Cassiodorus' letters. It seems to me that these customs and their linguistic implications have their roots in the language of private patronage, of which we have important evidence in Latin, for example, in the Flavian period. If this is correct, the legitimizing force of this option by Cassiodorus would be even more pronounced in the eyes of an audience tied to Roman traditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. The incestuous love of Mira for her father in Ovid is definitely associated with the incestuous love of Perdicae for his mother. Actually, in the proem, the narrator of the Aegritudo Perdicae offers a cautionary note to the readers to not read the poem actually for the mothers. And the same thing we find in book 10 of Metamorphoses. And there is a cautionary note for fathers, I believe. And there are also a lot of common features in the poem. And the reason for this is, again, the fact that the poetry that was written during the Regnum Vandalum was particularly elitist, and the poet of the Aegritudo Perdicae wants to engage in a literary dialogue with a lot of other texts.
Now I'm waiting for Anastasiia.
Okay, yeah, I just waited maybe for your feedback. You mentioned Flavius Eutychius. Did I hear you well?
I can't hear you very well. Maybe it's just a problem.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes, a little better. Mm. Mm.
Okay. Did you mention Flavius Eutychius, or did I? Maybe I had bad connection.
Now, I was wondering whether it is possible to widen the contextualization of this peculiar mixture of elements in some of Cassiodorus' letters, because we have a mixture of paternalism and vocabulary of friendship, and this reminds me of some features of the language of private patronage that we have, that we can see especially in the literature, in the Latin literature of Flavian Age. If this is correct, if this is acceptable, I think that the legitimizing force of this option by Cassiodorus could be considered even more strong because he was appealing to an audience that was in some case deeply tied to the Roman traditions.
Yeah, I understood you now. Sorry, because my connection was bad. I didn't maybe decipher all the words correctly. Yes, I do contextualize it even broader in my my studies. And I remember some even mentions of Tite Livius of this language of patronage during the Flavian Age. The fact that the figure of the princeps was imagined as a sort of father and patron and all this paternal figure generally. And I think there is a connection, direct connection between self-representational strategy of Ostrogoths, who tried to be less of the Roman dominus and more of the Roman princeps. And so they used kind of this rhetoric to position themselves and to present themselves. And from this angle, yes, it also deepens and widens the contextualization. But also, it's very difficult on a textual level, if the level of intertextuality, if you say metatextual level, how much did Cassiodorus really rely on the text which mentions this rhetoric, or in which form he might have received this rhetoric, or through which form he might have received this rhetoric. But the idea, I agree with you, and thank you for mentioning and highlighting this. I will definitely put this in more prominent places, truly widens the framework. If you have any maybe ideas how to trace intertextuality, I also very open and welcome it in this respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
I do have
Maybe,
a question.
yes, maybe Anastasia, in fact, sorry.
Yeah, very short one. I will try to be brief for facility, because I have many questions myself. But not. I was wondering just about how it's the poem itself is Aegritudo, like suffering, and in a way, it's sort of it's poetic in a way. So, like a prolonged progymnasmata exercise where you pretend to be Perdicae, you imagine Perdicae suffering when he falls in love with his mother. And this made me thinking about like Strassamund and Vandal Kingdom, and the idea of like reviving antiquity in the Vandal Kingdom, again, cultural literary production during this era. And then comes my question. So whether it could be that, do you consider this option that this could be just a rhetorical exercise in elegiac poetry for a pure purpose of demonstrating your identification with the ancient culture, or whether it was still something more of, I don't know, whether there are other intentions which are guiding in this case? Thank you.
I think that Aegritudo Perdicae is an epilion and not a rhetoric exercise, but the themes of rhetoric during that period, I think that they have influenced the anonymous poet of the Aegritudo Perdicae.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you too.
Okay, is there any other question? Also in Italian, don't worry. Well, we are also in time, on time, perfectly on time. So thanks again to our speakers. I would like to congratulate again, and as well, not only for their presentations, but also for the insightful answers during the discussion. I would also like to thank you all for participating tonight. The next meeting of our seminar series will take place next Tuesday at the same time, and we will have two speakers. It is the last meeting of our seminar series. We will have two speakers. Katharina Hoft from Friedrich Alexander Universitat di Nuremberg will speak on anger on Claudian, and Despina Joseph, that I saw at one time from the college here in Athens, will present a paper on emotions as emblems of early Christian identity. So thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening, and see you on Tuesday, next Tuesday.
Thank you very much. See you on Tuesday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.